Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Sarkis and this is my presentation on the history of education, the Progressive Nation period, 1900 to 1950. So what was life like during this time period? The U.S. was flooding with immigrants. School was the place where the American dream was nurtured. School was overcrowded due to immigration. Child labor was prevalent. World War I and World War II, and fear of nuclear attacks. Some important historical events that happened during this time period included World War I, the Great Depression, which affected education because children were not able to go to school because they had to support their families, and there were large amounts of labor unrest. The first child labor laws, which made it now mandatory for children to attend school, and World War II, where people were in constant fear of nuclear attacks and drills were taught in school. Some laws concerning education included the National Education Association, or NEA, which focused on curriculum and other education concerns, the American Federation of Teachers, or AFT, which focused on labor, the Committee of 10, which standardized high school curriculum, Committee of 15, which reduced elementary schools from 10 grades to 8 and standardized curriculum, the Committee on College Entrance Requirements, which standardized college entry requirements, and 7 Cardinal Principles of Education, which set a primary guide for education in the United States. So, what were schools like? Progressivism began in the early 1900s with the works of John Dewey's School and Society. He later became the father of progressive education. Gary, Indiana displayed the most progressive schools. This was the first appearance of large school buildings and class change. Schools were meant to keep the students constantly stimulated, and schools filled in where the parents couldn't with things like personal hygiene. Schools wanted to preserve the American way of life, which only taught in English and taught manners, which displayed Americanization, and schools opened at nights and weekends to deal with the overcrowding. So New York wanted to integrate the Gary curriculum, but immigrant families did not agree because they wanted their children to have high-paying jobs like lawyers or doctors instead of learning to become factory workers. New York schools returned to the more traditional schooling, and new progressive educators wanted efficiency. They integrated English only, which was a sink or swim philosophy. If you didn't learn, you didn't make it. Programs became based on where people were expected to end up in life. They started using the intelligence test or IQ test with students as early as kindergarten to determine their potential for success. This determined if you were going to be sent in the trenches or if you were going to be given opportunities for higher ranking positions. Tests were only administered in English, and people believed ethnicity affected intelligence. The Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT, came as another form of IQ and placement testing, and we still see that today. The 1940s brought about life adjustment education. This extended progressive education to teenagers to make school relevant to their everyday lives. People were staying in school longer than ever before, so this taught things like how to date, proper time to get home from parties, hygiene, etiquette, and things of that sort. The rest of the world saw it as regressive. These were things that were supposed to be common sense. This gave progressivism a bad reputation. Everyone went to school if you were lucky enough to not be working. Schools were still segregated based on race. Things that were taught included basic skills like cooking and car repair, sewing, and things of that sort, basic education like math, English, and science, and more physics after Sputnik was launched, hygiene, etiquette, and prayers from a Christian-based education. A lot of the content was taught because the school system believed in a world with so many cultures and ethnicities, we needed to create a uniform society, or basically to Americanize everyone. Most of the students viewed school as means for obtaining a good job in the future. Some critical thinking questions to consider are: why were laws for standardizing education so important? What is a reoccurring theme in the different types of schooling in the new progressive era? Why were things like home economics taught in the Gary school systems? And what factors during the new progressive era influenced contemporary education? What were some positive and negative influences? So, to answer these questions, laws for standardizing education were so important because previous education was very different in other parts of the country. This made college admissions very hard to determine. A recurring theme in the different types of schooling in the new progressive era was the Americanization of schools. With immigration so high in the start of this era, school systems saw this as a necessity for peace in the United States. Things like home economics were taught in the school system because they believed a large cause of the labor unrest was because the families couldn't manage their budget. If things like home economics were taught, women would be able to cook good meals for their husbands so they could go to work with full stomachs, be more productive, and go straight home to their families after work instead of stopping at the saloon. Ideas from the progressive era are still widely used today. They create our education systems, including the progressive philosophy that most public education is based off of. Some positive and negative influences on education today. Positive includes creating standards for all schools to follow, and the philosophy of progressive education was introduced. Some negatives included failed to acknowledge culture and language barriers, and IQ and SAT standardization of tests.